Thank you all for being here, and welcome to the Center for Ballet and the Arts. I'm Jennifer Homans. I'm the founder and director of the center, and I'm here to welcome you to tonight's event, Time, Disability, and the Making of an Opera, with Jerron, Herman, and Mara Mills. For those of you who don't know us, and I think there's several of you in the audience tonight, you're sitting in the studio now of the Center for Ballet and the Arts, where our fellows rehearse and make dances. And upstairs we have a whole series of offices and administrative buildings and conference rooms and all of that kind of good stuff. Also for the service of the artists and the scholars who work here. We are an international research center for scholars and artists of ballet and of dance more generally, and of the related arts and sciences. We were founded in 2014, so we are now 10 years old. In our 10th year, this is our first event in our 10th year. So I think so. I think it's good. Our fellowship program brings together artists and scholars, the people who sort of make dance, and we include in this, people who are working in lighting and costume and theater design and architecture, anything to do with putting dance on the stage, and the people who study it, historians, philosophers, art historians, scientists, across the academy we bring people. This is one of our first public programs to actually grow out of our fellowship. Jerron Herman is a fellow here this year, and so this work comes out of some of the work that he is doing. Mara Mills is also a former fellow and an NYU faculty member, and the director of the Center for Disability Studies, or a co-director, and she has sort of helped us to think about disability studies and how we might sort of bring this to the public out of our fellowship program. Tonight, the sort of plan of the evening for us tonight is that Mara and Jerron will discuss opera and disability and Jerron's approach to choreography and design for the upcoming 2025 world premiere of Sensorium Ex, a contemporary opera composed by Paola Prestini, who is here tonight. I don't know, where is Paula? She's here. There she is. With a libretto by Brenda Shaugnessy and co-direction by Jay Scheib, who's also here. I don't know if everybody's here. So the evening is going to investigate the ways that disability shapes time. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, with a particular focus on the possibilities and paradoxes of fermata in Herman's work. We're going to take questions at the end of the presentation, so please don't hesitate to have a question stored away to ask. And I should just say up front, because I always forget to say it later, that there is going to be a reception afterwards. We have some lovely things to drink and eat, so please do stay with us at the end to continue the conversation. Okay. We're going to get there very soon. I'm going to stop talking. A few words from me about Jerron, who's a very, very special person and fellow. I've become so happy to get to know him and to understand his work better. He's a dancer, he's a choreographer, and as an artist, he has used disability to explore new possibilities in dance and the expressive capacities of the human body. One thing I've learned from him that interests him very, very deeply, I think, is time, and how disability, his own and others, opens new ways of thinking about time. And in particular, he is working on this idea of fermata. And I was just sort of looking at this myself earlier today, so to remind us all, fermata in music, from the Italian, I'm going to butcher this, fermare, it means to stop or to stay. And it's a sign that allows the musicians to pause. And this idea of pause, I think, is very important for a moment on a particular note. And obviously the question that comes to mind is, what happens in that pause? Is it an opening for improvisation? Is it a prolongation of the past? That is a form of memory. Or is it a form of silence? Perhaps most relevant to us tonight is, how do you use the fermata in dance? How do you visualize it and bring it to life in the human body? And how can disability expand its meaning and use? Those are some of the questions that I have, and Mara and Jerron will have others as well. Mara is an associate professor of media culture and communication at NYU. And as I said, she's co-director of the Center for Disability Studies. She works at the intersection of sound studies and disability studies and programs disability arts events at CDS. In 2018-19, Mara collaborated with the writer Georgina Klieg on a crowdsourced description of the pas de deux in George Balanchine's Agon for an installment of Netta Yaroshalmi's Paramodernities. And in 2022, when she was a fellow here at CBA, she documented this working process with Klieg and wrote an article about description in dance and how you describe dance. So sort of moving in the other direction, you know, how do you actually put what's happening in the dance back onto the page? So at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Mara and let her take over and introduce to you, Jerron, a little bit further, and then we will have, I think, some performance tonight and some further conversation, and then we'll open it to you. Mara, where are you? There you are.
Thanks, Jennifer. Hiding in the front row, I was. So I'm going to do a little bit more of an introduction of Jerron. This is such a pleasure for me. And then the focus of tonight will be the performance. Thank you to the Center for Ballet and the Arts for bringing Jerron Herman to NYU for the whole year as a fellow and for organizing tonight's event. I am Mara Mills. Thank you for introducing me, Jennifer, and for inviting the Center for Disability Studies to co-host. I'll briefly describe myself for access purposes. I'm a middle-aged white woman wearing black. Actually, I'm wearing a little bit of navy blue today. That's very odd. I have brown curly hair. I'm short. And we are here together on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape people, past, present, and future. We're joined by a team of ASL interpreters and a remote CART captioner from Sign Nexus. If you would like to use CART, please use the QR code either on the screen or there's one on the inside of the program. And you can access live stream captions then on your phone or on your laptop. If you have any issues with captioning during the event, it might be a little hard to let me know, but you can also let one of the CBA staff know, like Kristen, who's sitting in the back. Okay, so now I'm so pleased to add my words of introduction and admiration for Jerron Herman. I don't want to distract him from the photo shoot, who has graced our campus for the last 6 months. This is not Herman's first year at NYU, it turns out. He studied playwriting as an undergrad at Tisch before deciding to transfer and finish his BA at King's College. So I'm really delighted that we've enticed him back to the NYU campus. As Jennifer said, he's a dancer, a choreographer, a curator, a fantastic author. If you don't know his writing, a lot of it is compiled on his website. Let's not forget, he's also a model. I guess that's maybe no one would forget. Yes, yeah. It's really difficult to write a brief introduction for him, partly because Herman has received a list of accolades that's like longer than my arm, taller than I am. His CV is so long. I do want to just start with the announcement last week that he's one of the 2024 United States Artist Fellows. So many congratulations, Jerron. I won't go through all of his other awards because they're in the blurb in the program. A really important one, I'll just say, is the 2020 Disability Futures Fellowship from the Ford and Mellon Foundations, a new program that we're extremely happy exists now. He was also featured on the cover of Dance magazine in March 2021. Herman has performed also seemingly everywhere in the city and beyond in the past couple of years alone. Gibney Dance Center, I remember that performance curated by Alice Shepard very well. The Whitney Performance Space Participant, the Met, MoMA, recently at a late shift event at the Guggenheim, really organized by Chitra Ramalingam, who we're also grateful to have here. That was a fantastic event, a performance of a piece called Lax, a meditation on ebb and flow and rest, so another take on time and movement. That was also co-sponsored by the Center for Disability Studies. Herman is an amazing collaborator, also a muse to so many other artists that I would say his thinking, gestures, and choreography are really threaded throughout the burgeoning disability arts movement, at least as I've followed it over the last decade or so. He's worked with Alice Shepard, who is also a CBA fellow, Carolyn Lazard, Tina Zavitsanos, Tourmaline, Molly Joyce, Heidi Latsky, among so many others that I'm not too many to list. He's also one of the organizers of I Want to Be With You Everywhere, a festival that took place in 2019 and again in 2023. I hope if it takes place again, everyone here will attend. This festival is such an landmark moment in disability arts for bringing this field and access techniques for the arts to much wider attention, and yet somehow still managing to feel like a party and a crip meetup. As you might imagine, it's really daunting to introduce Herman because he himself is such a fabulous moderator, facilitator, and curator himself. And he describes his practice as facilitating welcoming, which I love. And you've even written an article from 2019 about facilitating events called On Stewardship, which I'm glad that I've now read. I wish I had read it long ago. And he writes about moderating an event at the Whitney in this piece, and I'll just read a quote from you. You can play the facilitator or actually facilitate. Accessible doesn't just mean easier, it means equitable. How can one enter into a space on their own terms, knowing where the bathroom is located, how many steps to the bar, who surrounds me? There's tension in access because it can shift. When we approach access like art, it retains a form of care. At CDS, I think we last hosted you, besides popping in at the Guggenheim, a couple of years ago to celebrate your collaboration with Lazard on Long Take, an installation at ICA Philly and the Walker Art Center that also had a lot to do with sound and time. This piece was made up of a narrated dance score written by Lazard, the recorded sounds of Herman dancing, and an audio description of the performance minus any video recording. So quite an amazing piece. So his works often explore translation, sound as it relates to motion and also time, the aesthetics of access, and what Lazard describes as Black crip methods of obfuscation and thickening. And tonight, we're lucky to experience fermata. For me, this is the first time to get to experience this piece. It's a preview and an outtake of a longer work to be released next year, an opera, Sensorium Ex, engaging with opera and crip time. And after the performance, we'll have some Q&A with Jerron, perhaps also composer Paola Prestini, who's here, singer Hailey McAvoy, and pianist Forrest Eimbold.
There once was a woman who was a scientist and a mother. She'd work in the lab telling stories. Come home to sing data to you now. A day song for long nights, Kitsune. To light our way through a storm of dark worries. Tomorrow's dark stories. choosing not to fly, but it's not a choice. It's your voice. Deep and high, ground to the sky, silent square, full and despair, and dreaming on the between the trees and me, on the air, keeps you from me. You sing like a bird reads. I don't know what you need if it's not a song. A bird is made to sing.
So I have to say, I have been obsessed with the idea of fermata, or I should say like cripping fermata, ever since you mentioned this project to me. I did the same thing. I had a layperson's sense of what fermata meant. I also looked it up in a couple of dictionaries, and it occurred to me that it can refer to sound or to silence, which I hadn't really thought about what that might mean before. A prolongation of a musical note or a rest. And of course, I'm so curious about which of those things you're more interested in prolonging across the whole opera. And a lot of my interest is driven by the fact that I've been working since 2017, hopefully this will end this year, on a book about time stretching with Jonathan Stern, a sound studies scholar at McGill, also a disability scholar. Time stretching is technology for recorded sound that allows one to play back a digital sound or a tape-recorded sound and speed it up or slow it down without the pitch changing. And it was the precursor to things like auto-tune, which allow you to change pitch without changing time. So believe it or not, we've spent years working on a very long book about this and its relationship to disability. And it does have a relationship to disability. It originated in blind speed reading practices, and there's just so much more about that. So Jonathan and I, in framing this book on the history of technology, have had to think a lot about what crip time is. And there's so much work in disability arts, activism, and theory that uses this phrase, crip time. I think Ellen Samuels was one of the first people to write a formal article on this phrase that's very common in the community. And originally, crip time was theorized as slowness and slowing down. But in the last 10 or so years of disability theory, there are many other theories of crip time. You know, there's madness and ranting and mania and fast time, perseveration and other forms of autistic time, repetitive time, the time of a stutter, repetition and interruption. So there's this burgeoning of ways of thinking about crip time now, in activism and arts. And so I want to ask, for this component of Sensorium Ex, I want to ask you, how did you arrive at the concept of fermata? I know we're only seeing a small fragment here. Tell us, how are you working with fermata?
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for that primer, Mara. It's good to be here. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to have you and my collaborators to my left and in front of me. It's really absorbing, and I think that is a form of fermata as well. I think I'm thinking about it critically for the world of the piece itself, that we can start to even engender different practices for ourselves behind the scenes, so that they're materially evident on stage. And that is processes our slowing down has really been about making sure that everyone is on the same page about what this piece means, who's on, how they get on. I mean, we did a rigorous audition process that Paula spearheaded, and so there's a bit of osmosis going on, wherein similarly to what the field is doing, some of my vocabulary is coming straight from Jerome Ellis, and the relationship to disfluency, and the glottal block, particularly in the mouth gape, gaping mouth kind of phrase or image, has definitely spurring on from his imagery, their imagery. And for this particular moment, it was a redo of something we did in South Africa. We did another presentation of Sensorium Ex for, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the name of the Artscape, but what was the name of the festival? It was Unmute Festival. And which is it's a kind of an I Want to Be Everywhere in Cape Town, disabled-led and integrated. And we presented a section of that, and the bird was evident in that section, and this idea of a kind of an animism, relationship to the action on stage, and kind of the outpouring of the character at the time, Mem, and where she was going. And I think there's something around the ecstatic that I'm really excited about, that's always kind of been evident in my work, that tries to come out in the mania, almost like the building of, the pressure cooker, and then the slowness. I think the slowness of a collapse, of of a sustained, a suspension. Those kinds of things are really in the gumbo of where I'm going with vocabulary. And so this was, I just selfishly wanted a time to dance with Hailey too. I just wanted a moment to be with her. And this section is really special. It's kind of like where we all kind of began in the work, or at least that where my first entry was really here as well. So there's a lot to why this piece.
I'm going to ask a follow-up, and then maybe if any of your collaborators want to join in too. Just because you mentioned Jerome Ellis, and probably many people in the room know Jerome's work, musician, artist, writer, performer, stutterer, who theorizes stuttering and theorizes the stutter as a pause. But not just any pause. It's a pause. I think Jerome writes that it opens up time by creating a very unexpected interruption. So it's not a typical fermata, which might be planned into a score. It's an unplanned pause that, through its jarringness, creates a break in. Typical time or a typical social sphere, and allows new things to emerge and new relationships to emerge. And so, I read Jerome Ellis's work and listen to his jazz and performances. So I can see exactly how fermata would, as you described, would interact with what Jerome is doing. But I'm curious, how are you, either in this piece or the longer work, are you finding moments where you're doing very unexpected interruptions? How has that emerged as you've collaborated with Hailey?
Even what we just played with today, do you want to talk about maybe, or the difference between states or embodiments, the ability to have, I'll say, because I think in my relationship to my body, I always prioritize a kind of state. If that means arm behind the back, or certain kind of stability or preferred stability in order to do something. And we were kind of playing with this idea of what is not being stable, look like, or how does that play in, and whether or not there could be an affect or an aesthetic quality. Because there are so many things that we're thinking of. We're trying to dance, trying to sing, trying to remember our words, and key into words. And that, I think there was opportunity and it just reminded me there's opportunity in staging and in in levels that really do kind of punctuate or bring out emotionality, and especially in a disabled context or a person with a history of disability, that their story comes out in quakes in different kinds of ways. And so it's almost like activating that part, or kind of creating scenarios wherein the work activates their story. Yeah.
And I think I had to think about it for a minute, but so of course music, the medium for music most of the time is time. It's a very important part. And in Sensorium, we do have one character who speaks in unconventional ways. And for him, there are many fermatas written into the score so that he really can have exactly how much time he not only needs, but would like to embody the fullness of the expression that he's going to share with us and with the audience. So that is really special. Those parts of the music I have a lot when I'm with him, but when I'm singing by myself, I'm usually going forth in time in a relatively predictable manner. But I think for me, the concept of fermata, which, if I'm being honest, it's still a big learning curve for me, coming from a world that is, as we all know, ableist at times, particularly the field of opera. I am not used to actually being able to take a minute in rehearsal and actually pausing and letting that be my fermata in the working process to say, oh, you know, I'd actually really like it if this were different. Like, that would actually be great for me. And that happened today. Like, Jerron and I were working on a choreography, the part where our arms were touching, and he's sort of shaping me into a pose. And when we first did that, I was standing. And at first I was like, okay, I can do this. But then I was like, you know, that's going to be one notch far from my palsied limbs. And I think that I would love to sit down. And if I can just sit down, I'll be able to be so much more present, like with the character. My body will literally be more available to move because I will not be bracing with like, I need to hold myself up, people are watching, you know? And like that idea of that can also be the pause when we're working to say, is everyone able to do what they need? And not only able, like, is everyone having fun? Is everyone actually having a good time? Because I feel like when we're talking about the way that disability is often met in the world, it's very connected with like utilitarianism and like, are you able to do what you need to do without consideration for, like, are you having a good time? Are you fully present? Are you able to make a contribution that you're really proud of and that really has your individual stamp? And for me, it's been a huge gift, like being part of this process, to really feel like I actually have the time and space to consider what I do need to get to that second level, that really joyful, generative level of contribution.
I'd love to hear a little bit about how this excerpt fits into the whole opera. For those of us who've been anticipating Sensorium Ex but don't know much about the arc of it, if you could tell us a bit about that.
Absolutely. So Sensorium Ex is written by the poet Brenda Shaugnessy. If you don't know her work, please get to know it. It's a gift. She wrote My Andromeda, which is one of the most beautiful poetry collections ever. When we got this commission, we began to imagine this world. And it's really a world that Brenda has created that is so rich and so incredible. And so the scene that you've just seen is Mem, Dr. Mem, who is a lead scientist, and she's at home with her child, and her child is nonverbal, and so you're essentially witnessing a duet between them. And so much of the communication that happens is based in this concept of improvisation. And so the idea of improvisation written into opera, which essentially means space, and space for human contribution. And so to me that doesn't feel like such a leap, but what does feel such a leap is that in any kind of Western classical tradition, things are so rigid and things are so conventional. And so in trying to break from those conventions, there's been a lot of resistance to everything. And so I feel so blessed that we've been able to carve this space with our team to find this. But what happens in this scene is essentially the child Kitsune and Dr. Mem are at home. And they're communicating in the ways that they always communicate. And so what you're hearing is essentially bird language. So all of those, they're all the kind of bird kind of languages that she imagines that they're communicating between. And they're perhaps drawn from utterances that are common to their language. And so I guess it's a home scene. It's a scene of great calm, of great joy, of intimacy, and improvisation. And I feel very comfortable working with improvisation because I often work that way in my works. And so it feels very comfortable to do that in opera. But I think this extends one step further to just really ask the questions of how can you thrive? And I think when you're working with muses in this way, it would be crazy not to ask how can you thrive? because that's the way you get the most extraordinary, deepest level of communication. And so I think that's kind of what we're trying to find in this piece is how can Mycelia, one of the characters who is blind, how can she thrive? What is the communication space that she needs in order to fully embody that character? And so on and so forth with all the characters in the opera.
Maybe I'll ask one more question about a process and then see if anyone in the audience has a question. I'm really curious because I know your process of collaboration a bit and have written about it a bit, especially with Carolyn Lazard and others in the disability arts movement who really flip what is seen as being a retrofit or an add-on, the process of adding access at the end and turned access into a score, which actually comes at the beginning. So your collaborative process plays with time and plays with order and sequence. And even writing about so-called finished work of yours, I often have to think about the process to understand how you got there. Long Take was certainly like that. Was it an audio description of a finished work? Was the audio description itself the work? Where was the dance? Was it just the sound of the dance? And you and many other people in disability arts work quite a lot with scores. And the question is, what is a score? Is it the thing that's written first? Is it the thing that's written down at the end? So I'm curious about how you all, your team, has collaborated on the composition and also choreographic process for this. If any of you or all of you want to say a bit about that.
Yeah, it is. Ooh, go first. Well, I mean, I'll just say for choreography, forthcoming. Okay, I'm not done yet at all. Don't know. But I've been really blessed the last year to have studies. To have like spaces of studies. Meredith Phages is in the house over here, my good sister friend who I was with. We were in Heidi Latsky's company together, and she and another amazing dancer, Preston Berger. We did it like a 3-week residency at Rutgers, where we played with studies of Sensorium Ex, and that was where I got like the nature of mycelium in my body and the nature of of these characters in my body. And then shout out to Dance Lab New York, who also gave me a week with dancers, and it became an integrated company, and that was also another framework to think about movement and spatialization and spatial relationship. And then this year, thank you, Jennifer Homan, CBA, because this has really steeped me in fermata because I'm not rushed by time in the same way, and that has just opened up what is possible for my making. I usually start with fermata. I learned kind of like a chop and screw a lot of different people's practices. I think that there's an element of architecting that's really exciting to me, wherein I'm like from A to B, so scoring definitely, but like there is, I try to work from a linear movement. So I'm going from A to B with an idea, and then what does B to C look like, and then C to Q. It'll be something of, to try and get away from what's expected, and that, I think it's more kind of most distilled in what I just did from like right to left, and then to go in a curve, and then create relationship, and then what does the relationship do when I'm there, or what is when someone is there? Shapes are really important to me, and the feeling of imagery to move an idea. And so, just a couple things I'm playing with, but definitely there's a lot more reading, a lot more feeling, a lot more slowness. There's a lot going on. It's a bit of a gumbo, and I'm moving through it because this is also my first time with opera as well, and even I would say like kind of like metered, work in general. So it's new territory, but it's the team. To tell you the truth, like Paula has allowed me. She always says that she's like, oh, if there's anything that you need to expand or contract, like let me know. Like living composers for the win, and so that's what's happening, and so that's been a gift.
So there are some granular things that I think have been a real learning curve. Like, for example, in writing an opera, sometimes you're changing things at the last minute. But what I didn't understand was the kind of copy time that it takes to translate an entire score to Braille. And how unfair it is to not, for example, have the entire orchestration for a singer because of my last minute changes and the cost that comes associated with that. And so, one of the things that I'm hoping to normalize is like just the basic information of what it means to have accessible scores. That is just not made clear, and we've been through rabbit holes to figure that out. So one of the things that we've been talking about is how do we open up the process of what we've learned, not so that people can repeat it, because the point is not to repeat things. Every situation is unique, but just to say, this is one way to do it, and these are the resources it took, and it should get easier. So that's one thing. And the other thing is how many different ways of reading the scores exist in this piece, right? So we have, Thomas, who plays Kitsune, who's essentially reading and interpreting that in a nonverbal manner that we're still trying to explore and extrapolate and work into the fermatas. We have Hailey, who quite frankly I wrote the role for. Once I had heard her, and she came in to audition, I was like, I will change everything, just please say yes. I want you as this character. And so a lot of this idea of muse and range and so constant flexibility in order to, again, make sure that you have the people who are going to embody these characters and thrive. Then improvisation. We just were at the Kennedy Center, and orchestras don't improvise. So what does it mean to have such an inherent flexibility in our leads, and then an orchestra that's like, what's on the page? I want to learn what's on the page. And then you're like, wait, that's not really the point. So maybe I need to ask myself, is an orchestra really the best body of interpreters for this work? And so really challenging all the notions of what does it mean, and at the same time, what we're trying to do is to really form an understanding and a communication. Maybe at times it's going to be really uncomfortable, and that's also part of the point. But at the end of the day, I want the piece to thrive. So who are the best characters? And that's still some of the questions we're asking.
And I'm going to just add a little bit of perspective, like from the operatic standpoint, because as Jerron said, and as Paula alluded to as well, living composers for the win, right? Because, usually in opera, like the music is written and it stays that way. Mozart, can't call him, he's gone. And, it's very prescribed. Like if you have a certain kind of voice, you're allowed to sing blah, 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 and blah, but you can't sing blah, 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 and blah, because it's just not the right range for you, so you just can't do it, right? And even for this opera, when I auditioned for this role, it was written for someone who had a slightly higher voice than I do. And I thought okay, I'll just learn it to the best of my ability, and I will only sing it at the height that it's written 4 times before I go and audition, because it's a little too high for me, right? So I'll just do it like that, and then we'll see. If they really want me to do it, Paula can move it down a little. And that's what happened. But that's to me, this is a huge, because at the end of the day, in a much more classical structured form, right? That is also accessibility. Right, for my voice, for me to be able to do this. And honestly, that, if that is where we're starting, the music will be able to change. That gives me faith that any creative idea that I have will be welcome and will be able to be incorporated in this way that is highly unusual. Usually it's okay, if you're playing Hansel and Gretel, you have to look like this. You have to be this tall. If your hair is long, you better put it in a hat even when you audition, because if you have long hair, no one will believe that you could be a boy. You know, and it's just like, it's a little bit crazy, the degree to which you must conform to a certain image. And when we're talking about accessibility and ability and disability, and also the ways that those affect like movement, gait, time that we need to take, the way that we look when we move in the world, I mean, there are lots of ways that stuff can be projected onto us or forecasted for us that those things aren't true. And I think for me, like the most amazing part of collaborating on this work is knowing that I will not have to contend with those. Like, I will be seen as I am, not as someone fills in the blanks for me. And like, however I need to be to do my best work will be like lifted up. And that is very, very beautiful. And I know that will be present, like it's present in the music already. I know it will be in the movement and the staging. And I just think, again, because we're making this from scratch, no one has an idea yet of what it is supposed to be like. And that's very cool and very freeing, and a major opportunity to like not only create this work so beautifully, but in my mind, also to like, as Paula was saying, like if we write down, hey, this is how we did it, not that people have to copy us, but to say it can be done. And that's very important to me. Like, even if we're looking at more traditional opera, it can be done. To really include and really make the space, it can be done, and we're going to do it. Gosh darn it. And yeah, I'm very excited about that.
I'll just say one more thing about opera for me, that in my research or scholarship, there's a real connection with abundance in opera. I mean, we know opulence, like 7,000 people on stage, you know, moving from left to right. Have you seen Turandot's crystal tiara? Like, there's something really interesting about that. And yet, and then the opera houses themselves, you know, like there are definitely elements, but then there's a connection to access, to plushness, to, you know, throughways, and so, but I often, who's the patrons? They're older, richer, whiter, you know, and so I can see that there is that the users have demanded their space. You know, they've often said, "This is the space that I will be in and live in." Can that be related to emergent environments, to disability arts, to burgeoning QT BIPOC spaces, to spaces that are, you know, migrant-led or immigrant-led, to those who are international communities? Like, is there something around the idea of abundance that is really lauded in these privileged spaces? Are there practices, are there like little things that we can adjust and like take on ourselves, you know, in those more comeuppance, you know, come upper places? So that's what I'm really curious about. What's the translation from like why, you know, the Met has its seating like it does, or its elevators so replete with elevators, and captioning embedded, and all these aspects of, you know, the embedded nature of access in these, you know, rich places. What's the pathway to, you know, the grassroots? And so that's what I'm also really curious about.
I know we don't have an orchestra here, but we did have a pianist. Did you want to chime in about, yeah?
Well, thank you so much. Well, I mean, it's so wonderful to be here, and I'm just thinking about the meaning of the word music and its derivation from the term muse, which we were just talking about. This force which takes hold of us and in which we are able to be held ourselves, fermata'd in a very real way. And it's been amazing hearing about the ways in which fermata incorporates itself in our work. Because, of course, a score, whatever it looks like, and whatever it feels like, however we encounter it, always exists at the intersection of ability and disability. It always happens at the limit between those two things. And so it's amazing to have a project which is explicitly based on that framework, rather than having it be this thing which is implicit, but maybe brushed to the side as it so often is.
If you want to stay here, I'm so glad we're getting this conversation on record, although we're not posting it online. I imagine this could be so. My brain is already like, I can teach this. Thank you all for impromptu coming and sitting up here, because we didn't ask them to do this ahead of time. And I love hearing about how you work together and learning more about this. And I have a feeling that there's people in the audience who have questions for you too. So let me take a minute to invite all of you to ask a question.
Thank you all so much for this. And you've spoken a lot and quite movingly about the ways in which the process of making this opera, which is where you are right now, you're in the process, is focused on sort of the allowance and flexibility and the ways in which you can become the best artist that you can be. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to, in my experience anyway, even the best situations have tensions, and the tensions can be productive. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the tensions in that process. You were beginning to allude to that a little bit, just are there, and what are they, and how, and I don't mean like between, personalities or something, but within the sort of guts of the work and the issues that you're dealing with disability especially.
The hard question. I'm like, tell me about your collaboration. It's like, no, tell me about the tension.
I want to start by saying that this piece began as a commission that was dropped. And it was dropped specifically because this major opera company did not want to deal with what it took to bring this piece to stage. So tension actually began the entire process of saying, okay, now we no longer have support. Do we do this? Which, of course, we were going to do it because it was important and amazing, but the whole thing began in the question of contention and stress and the ideas of scarcity, which are so prevalent in our industry. This idea that you spend money on stuff and not people. It's so gross and tired. Sorry, but yeah, that's where it began. It began in this place of, okay, so you reject us because you don't want to go on this path of discovery. What a shame. Okay, enough. Let's move on, and then let's regather and let's find ourselves. And so we found ourselves, and oddly, one of the things like that we really had to ask ourselves is, do we go across the world to just try to find a way? Because one of our advisory board members runs Artscape, which is a place that centers equity through disability justice. And she said, come here. Come, you're stressed. You don't find an open door. Come here. We will help you. And that was the very first thing. It wasn't perfect, but the point isn't perfection. The point is just one door to lead to another door, to lead to another door, and never to take no for an answer, right? Which is, of course, a privileged way of looking at things, and I understand that. But we couldn't take no for an answer because the piece deserves to be seen. But of course, we don't know what it's going to look like, and we don't have the framework, and so we have a production company that's our own that just kind of builds every step, which is why it's taken 7 years instead of 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the tension in the content is evident in terms of the nexus or connection or relationship to ability and disability. I mean, this is the first time that I've been on a project where there's cross-disability conversation. So what does it mean for a blind person to talk to, a deaf person to talk to, a person with cerebral palsy, someone to talk to, someone who's non-speaking? Like, those complexities are so far-reaching and really novel, and have potential for for that obfuscation, for that, like, what's happening behind other curtains, and how do people relate beyond the normative or beyond the but similarly, I guess there was some tension for me because I wasn't sure that I could tell that story. I wasn't really sure the first time I read the libretto if, like, ooh, can I tell this? I was scared by some really I would say outdated sense of, like, what a disability story is, and I keyed into my discomfort with explicit and maybe even the vulnerable aspects of a disability narrative, to try to push this, like, we need to see it. It needs to happen. Like heroism or a kind of feeling or genesis of the or even like trying to stamp down the kind of narrative of like the Captain Hook or the disabled villain is like very noble. But I was really curious about like, what could be in the fragility and in the vulnerability conversation. So yeah, that was a big tension for me. Immediately, I was like, I was stuck. And so that was really exciting for me too, because it's like, artistically, I can push myself a little further. And here we are in a space of really reframing a lot of narrative and getting to a really cool place beyond what our preconceptions were.
Thanks. And I just wanted to share a kind of in the weeds, practical tension moment that arose in our workshop that we just did, but it wound up being one of my favorite moments of rehearsal because I was just like, oh yes, this is this team, yes. We were doing one of the most difficult sections because, as Paola was mentioning, there are some parts where there's some improvisatory nature, which is not the standard in orchestral playing, right? And somehow everybody has to know vaguely where they are, or there has to be some way of communicating, right? If we're all improvising and doing our own thing until X point, and then at X point we're going to go forward, whatever that is. And that is the responsibility of our conductor, who is so incredible. I just want to lift up her spirit in this room because she's so great. Elizabeth, ask her in. She's so great. And so we were doing this really difficult, moment. We're working through it, and she's finding her way that she's going to be able to lead everyone through it. And, one of the orchestra members raised a hand to ask a question, and even that is sadly unusual in the world of opera, that people would ask a question of the conductor. It's sad that it's unusual, but it's a little unusual, but she answered the question. She was there for it, and the questions kept on coming, and at one point she sort of stood up and went to the back of the room, and I thought oh my gosh, is she going to start pacing or something? But what she did was walk over to her bag to get her colored pencils so that she could take in everyone's feedback and write down every note in a different color so that she could hold it all and lead us through the performance. And I just, in that moment, I was this is the greatness of humanity. This is the greatness of the arts. The fact that people can be so in the weeds and facing the tension of just how are we gonna make this go? As a machine, how are we gonna do it? And not giving up, not saying no, having the tenacity to stay in it and find the best way. And I just loved that. I just loved it.
And I was going to say, and that's with a union orchestra. So just, keeping in mind that that kind of openness, knowing that you're on the clock. It's how do you do this kind of work and expand the mind and expand the, the kind of the empathic need while understanding because at the end of the day, I'm also a producer, that the money is running out and that we're going to be over. I mean, it's like, what the hell are we doing, you know? And how do we make this work in the way it's supposed to work? It's such a challenge, and it's so beautiful, and it's so heartbreaking at the same time, you know?
Yeah.
Sure. I think the only thing I have to add to that is relating to the clock, that as someone who is over there in the business of keeping the clock, as we all are, but with visual accountability to the score in that moment, we're not simply talking about getting rid of a clock, although of course that, you know, is an option in certain settings, but something which seems in some ways even more radical, which is developing a different way of relating to the clock entirely. And that seems to be a common theme that just keeps on cropping up in workshops, in performance.
You can't rewrite all the systems. I mean, it'd be great if you could rewrite all the systems, but you can't. So, like, you know, yeah.
No. Exactly. Amazing.
Other questions? Oh, yeah.
Hi. You guys describe your work environment in such a beautiful way that frames accessibility as an art that's just palpable. I can feel it. We talk a lot about social and environmental models of disability in the sense that disability is created by our surroundings and preconceived notions. What does it mean to you to create a space where those barriers are actively taken down, and how do you see that expanding and progressing into other areas of the arts?
Not a small question for Jerron.
Access as art is I'm really compelled by because I say access is giving an audience or people the most information to make decisions for themselves and their thriving in their relationship to the space. It takes out the guesswork. And in relationship to art, catharsis is really important to me. And so how, I think access, for some reason, I haven't really identified, but it is the closest I can think of as the exhale. You know, the content, it's the context version of the content exhale. Because I've never been as tired as when I'm surrounded by a CRIP audience, a disabled audience and disabled creatives, because I'm not masking anymore. I'm not being asked to mask, and I'm not kind of wading in a pool of superiority or of super normative expression. Instead, I'm myself, and becoming an artist is really is really decadent already. So why not? Why not push it? There's just really a necessary relationship to how processes through how disability arts specifically helps to open up architecture. Hey, architecture folks from Columbia and others. How it opens up design, how it opens up so many different pockets because of there's structural frameworks, there's structural foundations for all that we have. And so you can, and the other thing I'll just say lastly is that I'm really compelled to help people associate with themselves with their own sense of relationship to disability writ large. You don't have to have a disability to recognize that you have a different relationship to time, or that you need a rest in some way, or you need to filter into this kind of wave of being, because thriving and being human is really vulnerable, is really messy, and how can we ask a mess not to be a mess?
I think someone gestured to as an architect. Yes. Good. Perfect.
Thank you. Yes, we're the architects and architecture students over here. Hailey, I really loved your story about the new method of annotation that the conductor came up with to solve a problem. So you couldn't use the typical tools of the trade, and so you came up with she came up with a new way to approach the task. Are there other examples of new methods, new tools that you all have come up with to create something that you're trying to create that no one's really done before, and you can't use the old tools?
Since I'm holding the microphone, I'll just say a quick word, which I got to preface this by saying, I feel like a noob, actually, right now, because I have not been part of this disability arts scene for a long time. I have been someone who was aching to find this and didn't know that it existed, kind of, until I got into this project. At least not in opera, not in my field, And so, when you ask, new tools that have never been seen before, if I answer you truly, the answers are so... Honestly, they're sad because they're not revolutionary tools at all, but I had never seen them before this. And it's stuff like an optional 20-minute long access check-in at the beginning of the day, a call from an access coordinator 3 days before you arrive, an image description of the space, including an accessibility description. Just the option to disclose access needs, at least in the operatic field, that is, I could count on one hand the number of times that I have been able to just say that without having to make the space for it myself and fear that in so doing, I will be barring myself from an opportunity, right? And so just... having the time and the space and the intent to communicate and actually care. I mean, it shocks me that I'm saying it's new and revolutionary, but here we find ourselves. And I think especially in terms of architecture, because architecture can't change overnight. Buildings don't change overnight, so that's those are going to be something that we have to navigate for a while, probably, at least in my imagination, which might be limited. I'm sure it is. But really, for me, just knowing, there's nothing that hurts me more than if I go to an audition and I ask the proctor, is there a step to get from the ground to where the piano is? And they say, gee, I've never thought about it, which people say a lot because they haven't. And they just don't realize how much that stings if you're someone who's more nervous about walking to the piano than you are about singing your song. And so it's just actually just the time, the image description, the space description, revolutionary tools to me.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Mic drop.
Yeah, excellent.
That is a good place to pause. And it is a pause because we are going to transition into a reception after a closing word from Jennifer Homans.
I just want to take a moment to thank you all for being here, and I'd like to especially thank the CBA staff, Christian, Shui, and Ame, who have made all of this possible this evening for us. Thank you for being here.